This conference is now being recorded.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the New York ASBO webinar, Effective Control Techniques for Contractor and Construction Quality. Your presenter today is David Cornegay. He is from SchoolDude.com. He is a Senior Applications Engineer and the Mayor of SchoolDude.com. If you have any questions whatsoever during the presentation, you can use the chat window on the right-hand side of your screen. Or if you'd like to talk to Dave, you can hit 7# on your phone. That'll notify me that you want to ask a question, and then I'll break in, and you and Dave will be able to talk. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dave.
Sounds great. And if you want to, you can give me administrative, and I'll change the slides, but I certainly don't mind if you want to change the slides. One of the things that I usually do with my bio, for example, I've been in the industry for about 13 years, and I use the word predominantly for a reason. There was a year that I was not working strictly with education. There was a year that I was a construction project manager, which is basically a way of saying essentially I was the middleman. I would report to, in this case, it was the military, about what contractors were doing. I had to coordinate with the contractors, and I had to work primarily with making sure that the base I was working on at the time was making sure that the construction jobs were working well, that things were in control. We had a whole series of quality assurance processes to make sure everything was fine, and it was basically dotting the I's and crossing the T's, but also dotting the J's. So that's why you may see me use the word predominantly, and we're going to take today's session and we're going to pull in my experience from there and tailor some of the best practice techniques of how they may work more in the educational environment. So beginning with that little bit of a preview, if anyone has ever been associated in any way with the military, you may notice there's a whole series of abbreviations. So one of the ones that deals with quality assurance and quality control techniques with contractors is the term CQM equals QC plus QA. So we'll be talking about some of the things with the abbreviations. We'll talk about determining what should a project entail. We'll also be talking about quality control plans and some of the processes with it, some of the communication and expectation techniques that you may want to consider, and how they'll drive many of your procedures. So we'll start out with a couple of abbreviations that you'll be seeing throughout the presentation today. So, for example, CQM is what's called Construction Quality Management. But you also see QCM, which is a Quality Control Manager that we'll be talking a little bit about what role they're going to play in this, and it's essentially a point of contact, just to give you a bit of a preview. But then you may hear some people use the term interchangeably of quality control and quality assurance. Now, there is a slight difference. One of them is about making sure you have a quality product, and then the other is making sure that the process behind that is assured. It's a quality assurance to make sure that product is installed correctly and that it's working as intended to fit your scope. But another term that you're going to see quite a bit is DFOW. This is essentially definable features of work. You'll hear an abbreviation used a lot with projects such as SOW, which is scope of work. This is basically a subset of that. What are the features of that job, or essentially what would be the equivalent of a task in a project? Now, QC and QA have some slightly different responsibilities. You might have different people that are checking up on things. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, well, who's going to be the responsible person? You always need a go-to person, whether they're a person that's an advocate of the project, making sure things run smooth, but essentially you need a go-to person internally and externally as well to make sure they understand what they're doing. And there's some questions they always need to ask themselves. Do they understand what role they play, the importance of their responsibility? So do they understand the mission of what this project is going to do? It sounds a little bit odd, but a person needs to understand what role they play in making sure things work well, and do they have the technical know-how? Making sure that they understand exactly what it is that is supposed to be accomplished. Do they have the technical chops to do it, or is it something they may have to research a little bit? But tact and good judgment is thrown in there for a purpose. Sometimes you need to make sure that you're communicating in the right way, you're not ruffling any feathers you don't need to ruffle, and then making sure that you can make a good judgment call if needed to make sure that you're getting a good quality project out of your contractors. And making sure that nothing's falling in through the cracks, especially if someone has a supervisor. What is the expectations of the director or the business officer or the board that they may be working with? Do you have a good understanding, or does this QC or QA person have a good understanding about what the expectations are supposed to be and what it is that they need to do to make sure that the process flows smoothly and that things are being documented? And first thing is you always have to set up what the goals are. We can't have a construction project or an upgrade to technology unless it fits the mission of the school. Does it help the department run efficiently, teach better, provide a safer, healthier, cleaner environment? But at the same time, we are throwing this big investment out there. If it's new construction, for example, we want to make sure that we keep our costs down while still staying on time and have a quality school that our kids are going into, if it's that type of a big project. And then does it have a relationship to any other project? Seems like when you have one project, another one seems to come along right behind it. Things usually have a tendency to fit into one another. So if I update an area, from the facility side, IT is going to might be affected, and that's going to drive another project. Or we need to fill in this gap on the business side. So these projects can end up driving into one another, and they may be some good things that you want to get a solid understanding of. So when we talk about some of the projects you may be working on, whether it's small or whether it's large, you need to be able to provide what I call the elevator speech. The elevator speech is basically saying we need a good, quick synopsis of what needs to be done or what we do. You need to be able to do it in a non-technical way because you're going to have people that are on the board, for example, that may need to understand about a project in a way that's not too deep into details. Not everybody's going to be interested in details. You can determine the scope of work and what those definable features and tasks and subsets and milestones are, but you need to get that initial description first and then worry about the details a little bit later. So you're kind of dealing with the layman and you're dealing with the technician. Make sure that you're explaining things to them that they need to do. And make sure people understand what the quality control processes are from the beginning and to the end. When we start getting into a little bit later talking about the 3 phases to make sure that these projects are running smoothly, you want to make sure that the people involved have a good expectation of how you're going to do things from the get-go. What are going to be the expectations that you see to stay within these processes so we're not making phone calls and following up with emails and getting irritated that we're not hearing something or something's not being done. If you set up the expectations at the beginning, then things should not fall through the cracks too easily, and it makes it a lot easier to hold someone's feet to the fire whenever you need to. Also, any quality control needs that you have, they need to have the relatability to what the technical parts of the job will be and what the needs of that scope, and any information that might need to be passed down to subcontractors. So, many times you'll see where you might have a contractor if it's a large project, and then they've got subcontractors that are helping them out with the job. I know from my past experience that would be the case, where we would bring in one primary company, but they might have a subcontractor that does electrical work, we'll say, for example. So making sure that they're involved in any of the processes, so that way you've got a good sense that you're comfortable with their work and they're comfortable with your expectations. So let's talk a little bit about the plan. This was something I had to do as a contractor, was put together a quality control plan. Much of the information you're going to see me go through is actually from a specification. It's a subset of a document from the Corps of Engineers. It's technically called 0145 section of that where it talks about what are the expectations to put together in a plan. Some of these things you may want to consider setting up on your side, but maybe having the contractor fill in certain gaps. But essentially what this is saying we have expectations that not only are you going to provide a quality product, we're going to make sure that we're understanding that along the way. So explaining to those folks that need to be involved, either on the business side or on the contractor side or whatever the departments are being affected, explain the organization of how this plan is going to be in place, who's going to have copies and where those copies can be found if needed. And then if any changes need to be made along the way, what would be the procedures to make sure that thing gets done? Because essentially this could become a legal document. And you want to make sure that anything that gets documented in case something should happen along the way. And unfortunately, things do happen along the way. So making sure you've got the proper documentation to protect yourself as well as being able to keep people involved in everything. So talking about the organization of the plan, let's talk about the organization of the people that are in the plan. Many times we would put together some kind of an organizational chart, and I would usually flag who was a primary point of contact. Now, I wanted to know who were the people that were primarily doing the job, but sometimes I needed to flag certain people that says, if you have a question, call this person first at this contractor or at the business office at the school, having some sense of what the relationships are in some type of a flow chart. And the bottom is essentially the subcontractors, and I've blanked out the names, but this is literally from the documentation I had to put together on a project. So you'll see I'm actually using real live things that I'd implemented back in 2002, 2003, whenever I was doing this particular project that had a pretty big scope to it. I'll talk a little bit more about subcontractors and suppliers a bit as far as some of that breakdown, but essentially this is a primary point of contact list of who's out there and what responsibilities they have. And when it comes down to who's going to be on the job, one of the things we really had to do was we had to put together a list of qualifications. So we wanted to know who would be the engineer, who would be the project manager, who would be our shadow at the institution. And essentially, what was their previous experience? What projects had they worked on in the past? Where had they done it at? Do they have any certifications or licenses or anything to prove that they've been through some type of a training that will be relevant to the job? So trying to make sure we had all of our ducks in a row was one of the big things that was a precursor to the duties and the responsibilities. And we'll be talking a little bit about the three phases of control that a quality control manager would do. And again, it could be anyone that you just designate as a quality control manager. But you want to identify many of the responsibilities and where they're going to fall into place in making sure that they can work with contractors, they've got the legal right to work with contractors, and the documentation that might be necessary to set things up, track things down, and be able to have a record of documentation in case they need to go back through any of the files. And then any of the procedures that may need to fall into place. And you'll see where I'm going to have a few examples of things you could track. I'm not trying to scare anyone with bureaucracy or documentation. You may say, well, we don't need to go into too much detail, and that's fine. What I wanted to do was cover some of the highlights of what you may want to consider in your tracking process, but definitely feel free to use your own language and determine what you may want to track that's a little more conducive to the way you need to run things. So, again, going into the duties and responsibilities, one of the first things you have to do in addition to your internal folks is working with those external people like the contractors. And it's not just the contractor company. If they're subcontracting, you want to make sure you get that list of outside people, their qualifications that may be out there. Are they bringing in any consultants? Are they bringing in someone to do design work? Or I mentioned earlier a group that might subcontract out additional electricians that they don't have the staff for. You want to make sure they understand the scope of work as well. We would sometimes have procedures that says if we were working with company A who contracted company B, I may not be able to necessarily go straight to Company B to tell them what's going on, but I certainly would get them in the same room and say, this is what we're looking for. We need samples of this. We need expectations of that. We need drawings of this. We need a material list for that. So I would try to make sure to involve the primary contractor in addition to the secondary contractors, but it was always essential to make sure everybody understood, because if I translated something to contractor A, then I can't always guarantee that he's going to say the same things, enforce the same things, use the same language with contractor B. So make sure that you're discussing the scope of work with all of them and that you understand who they are and that they're qualified to do the work that needs to be done. And as far as some of those responsibilities, I mentioned earlier we want a quality product and a quality project delivered on time and safe and in compliance with the contract. I always laugh when I say, quality projects on time. We always had a joke in project management is that it's amazing how every project gets to 90% of completion and then it stalls for whatever reason. And in fact, this project that I did, the reason it stalled is because I left to come work at School Dude. But I catch a little bit of grief on that one every once in a while. But learning a lot from back then is that you need to have some quality processes in place in case a snag does come up, that someone doesn't start fighting with someone else. You've got the documentation to go back out there and look at it, but you've also got to identify any deficiencies, and a lot of these quality control procedures help root out some of those deficiencies, especially when we start talking about the 3 phases of controls here in a little while, is that those things help you identify more deficiencies than just a trust factor that's going on. You want to make sure if there's any documentation that testing has been done, and we'll have a couple of examples later on, we want to make sure that that does help make sure that we are seeing things, that we're looking for any quality items that are out there or any things that may not be adequate. And we want to make sure we're tracking anything that is not compliant. And sometimes it's the simplest things. I remember one of the parts of this project was that we had to install some communication routers and some other technical doodads up on the wall. Well, essentially the way that they had to rig them was they would take a piece of plywood and they would attach the wiring and the cables and all the boxes to it to plug into the network. Well, one of the things that they were supposed to do in that process was they were supposed to paint that piece of plywood with a fire-resistant paint. Well, because things weren't translated to the subcontractor, next thing you know, you've got this box up on the wall and it's non-compliant according to the specifications that were in the contract. Again, it just comes down to translation. And it's the simplest thing, but when you have to hold someone's feet to the fire and you want to make sure that you as the schools are getting a quality product, they had to tear it down, repaint. They had to paint it, and then put everything back up and back together again. Not an easy job when you saw all the wiring and the boxes that were on there. But it's things like that have to happen along the way, that if you define the work and hold their feet to the fire and something needs to be changed, you can legally say, we told you A, B, C, D. You didn't do C. Go back and do it on your own time, your own dime, and that's just the way it's got to be. So being able to identify those things and ensure it is critical. Any submissions that need to happen along the way, we'll talk a little bit about tracking documentation, but that's going to be one of the other key elements is if you need a piece of documentation, set those expectations and be able to follow up with them and make sure you've got those records. One of the other records that you're going to want to take a look at is when we're at the end of the project, we need to make sure we do a punch out, make sure that everything that we're looking for is taken off the list, so that way we can have a final acceptance and be able to document that, yes, we can pay you. You did A, B, C, D. We've checked it. We've punched it out. We can now, feel good about cutting you a check. So a lot of these responsibilities, a contractor needs to make sure that they understand and define to you that is their responsibility. I can tell you as a contractor and managing the subcontractors back then is that if I didn't do my job because of the subcontractors, oh boy, I caught Hades over it, and I held their feet to the fire. And I'm pretty sure there's still a table at that base with my fist in it from pounding on the table. You were told to do this, this, and this. And because we had it documented, they went out and did the job. Now, there were always things that would be a little fuzzy in the definition. And that's one thing I always tell people is don't have any fuzziness in the contract, the scope of work, what's defined, what's expected. Never use the back of the napkin approach. Never use just a conversation. Define it, list it, and be specific as needed, especially when it comes to documentation, drawings. I'll talk a little bit about that when we start going into submittals. So let's take a look now as far as some of the next topics is with the responsibilities. This was a great little but a matrix that we had put together where we said, okay, on the topic of project management, these are the typical things that are out there. Who's managing the progress of this? And a lot of people had to have some kind of involvement. You never wanted any blank rows, that if the contractor was responsible for this product or this process or this performance or this documentation, who else had involvement? But we wanted to make sure everybody knew exactly what their role was in a very simplistic way. When you're reading a contract, it gets a little tough. Now, you see a flow chart like this that I can just put up on a bulletin board or just quickly reference from my documents, electronic or hard copy. This is a great piece of information that says, okay, this is what your role in the organization is going to be. And this is only a half of a two-page document. So there were other people that, as far as who were coordinating communications, what type of communications, who were involved in meetings, who would do follow-ups with any action items that may be out there. So we wanted to make sure, especially with managing changes, it seems like every project has a change request just automatically built into it, like it just has to have a change along the way, especially when you're talking about facilities. You always end up running into something that was set up in the building 30 years ago that now you've got to make adjustments for. So include that into your processes too, of who can identify any changes that need to be necessary, who can submit them, who can approve them. No one should be able to just approve a change to the project. You got to make sure that things are documented because that could change the outcome. So who in that process was the people that were able to collect it, identify it, review it, secure it, adjust it, and document everything, and then make sure those changes went through. So the responsibilities matrix is just a handy little idea to keep in mind about the different people that are in the processes of administration and coordination and the actual implementation. So let's talk a little bit next. Let's see. There we go. So one of the things that we also did with the nitty-gritty details was we would essentially write a quote-unquote letter. A letter was just really a documentation of authority, and it really puts the teeth behind that responsibility matrix that I was just talking about, where we would say we've got a person that we've identified as a point of quality control. This person is someone who is a bit of an enforcer but doesn't have total control. So, they can't just control anything in the project. However, if they do see a problem, they have the authority to stop the work is something we would put into the letter. We would have that letter say what they could do as far as inspections with when they're going to do them, how they can do them, making sure that they're actually on site every once in a while. That would be one of the responsibilities, is sometimes you're going to have to shadow someone or check up with them on their work. Coordinating any of the testing that has to be done, but they don't have the authority to deviate from those plans and specifications. If you see a problem, you can say stop. I'll go back to that example I gave a little bit earlier where it was these boxes that were drilled on a board, drilled to the wall. The project manager, they weren't quite done with the work. They were about 95% done. Well, the guy who was my quality control manager, he saw the problem, recognized that the specification was not being met, and then he had the work stop. and the contractors lost their minds because they didn't understand what was going on. They get mad at my guy, and so I come in to defend him and say, look, he has the legal right to do this. Now, he cannot tell you to paint it blue or red. It just has to be a fire-retardant paint. But he has the right to do that. But this guy would come to me and say, hey, I just stopped the work for A, B, and C. What do you want to do next? And so we would go back to what the scope of work was that everybody had agreed on and said, okay, it does not say the color, but it does say that it has to be this type of fire-resistant paint. So contractors, I had the authority to go back and say, now contractor, you need to do this. You skip this step. So you deviated from the plan, you deviated from the spec, you need to go back and take care of it. But the other thing about this quality control manager is he is basically the one who's maintaining the plan, making sure that it's being enforced. He also makes sure if there's any documentation, such as any documentation for documentation. If someone submitted an as-built, a drawing, a list of specs, a list of material safety data sheets, any of that information that was submitted from a contractor for our records, we wanted to make sure we had it documented, that we received it, and we would also sometimes document where we stored it at. And I'll talk a little bit later about some ideas about how to structure where you keep some things, but we always want to make sure that if someone said, we sent you something, that we had it documented of whether or not we had received those specifications or if UPS was still maybe holding on to them. In fact, back then I wish we did have the online tracking with tracking numbers. It would have made the job a lot easier back then. But we always kept a log that says we received engineering drawings for this mechanical room upgrade. Was some kind of a documentation number that was on there. So, talking a little bit about about information as well, or excuse me, talking about where this could be documented, is we actually wrote it in a letter. So we basically would write this authorization letter or an appointment letter or a responsibilities letter, and it was addressed to the guy who was sitting next to me. Even though the guy was sitting next to me, we still had to document that we have given him the authority and his list of responsibilities. And he could actually take this letter with him. So if somebody like that subcontractor said, you can't stop me, he could actually flash this letter and says, yes, I can. I had the legal right to stop you right here and now. I can't tell you anything different except stop. But I can tell you with this letter I'm holding in my hand, signed by my business officer or whoever the case is, I have the legal right to stop you because this is what you agreed to in the contract. So essentially we would say, you need to be safe. You need to make sure that any tests that need to be done are performed, and make sure that, if they say, we did it, that you could say, I want the documentation. So we basically gave him teeth in order to work with a lot of these contractors. Again, it seems like it's a lot of bureaucracy, but at the same time, when you have to deal with different personalities and different projects, and, I hate to say it, but sometimes you get somebody a little shady, you sometimes have to have some way of enforcing it. I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But essentially, it was some kind of a power letter that we just made sure that somebody understood their responsibilities and they could show it whenever they needed to. So let's talk a little bit about, I mentioned that this gentleman deals with getting documentation and submittals. So, for example, this gentleman, he says, you are responsible for reviewing and ensuring that all submittals are reviewed, that they are checked to make sure they're in conformance with the plans and specifications. So let's talk a little bit about submittals of documents. You may want to consider using some kind of a documentation, whether it's a log, a spreadsheet, a registry of some kind, but essentially this would be one of the things that the contractors would fill out. Again, you can use your own documentation that you can make up. Hopefully they would have something of their own already. But what we would do is we would say, okay, we want you to list what it is that you submitted. We want to be able to see that on our side, see any comments that you made. But there was also a section of this form that we would provide to the quality control manager. And essentially what this quality control manager would do, I'm going to get a little John Madden here on you. So what this quality control manager would do is he would take a look at the document, and if everything looked great, then he would say approved. He would put this little A next to it, or whether or not it had been disapproved, or if he had comments. And the comments could be, for example, this might not be the right size. For that particular project, it was in a very humid area, and he said we cannot have, or we're going to need a dehumidifier in this particular area, or we can't use this pump, or we can't use this piece of material for whatever reason. So essentially, we would have the contractors fill out this form, and then the quality control manager would take a look at it and then give his thoughts, his viewpoints, his opinion. And if we needed to return it back, we could certainly return it back. But this was part of our procedure for reviewing any documents that came in, making sure that they were out there. And we also kept a log of a lot of these submissions that happened in along the way. So we would have another spreadsheet, for example, that we basically would say, we received QCP or whatever the document was on this date with this status. So we had a comprehensive listing. So we basically used this type of a document just as a scratch pad, but we also kept a log just as a nice little comprehensive list of what we had received out there. Okay. Now, talking a little bit about information. What if you need information? We just talked about if they send you information, but what if you need information? What we would also do is say, we're going to request information from you in a very specific way. I'm not just going to mention it to you while I'm at the job site. What I'm going to do is I'm going to probably submit something official, and the reason I'm going to do that is I'm going to hold your feet to the fire if you don't give it back to me, or at least I'm going to track the status of that request. So what we would do is we would explain the information flow. We would say, we're going to fill out the following form, document, or whatever the procedure may be, but we're going to identify essentially what it is that we're looking for. We're going to reference where in the contract we might be looking for it, such as a clarification or a follow-up or documentation or material safety sheets. So we're going to identify what it is we're looking for, how relevant it is to the contract, and then we're going to want to identify kind of what a priority may be on getting this information back. And usually if you're tying it back to the contract, it's usually a pretty high priority, as some contractors may know. But also, when do we expect information back? I don't want to just fill out a piece of paper just because I got the time, because guess what? I don't have the time. If I'm filling out this piece of paper for a reason, or filling out this form, or even if it was just writing an email, I'm writing it for a reason. I'm going to expect some kind of an answer. You can say it's going to take me till Thursday, but you need to give me an answer. So that's why it's important to say this is what we expect as far as getting information back. This is the format that we're going to want to see it in, whether it be, if you say email, say email. But if there's some kind of a documentation that you need for your legal reasons or risk management reasons, tell them, I'm not going to accept this because we've got to do that. So explain to them what the format is. And if there's any authority that you can do with enforcing when information is pushed back to you, I would definitely recommend that. But essentially, it's really supposed to be a formal method. I mean, it's okay to get a question in here and there. If I'm at, the project, I'm talking to someone who's doing a project for me. If I've got just maybe a clarification question, that might be okay as far as something minor, like how have you ever done this before? But as far as affecting the contract, I would definitely use something formal. This is not just, sometimes it's not just a conversational piece. This is something we need to have documented for legal reasons. Because the reason I stress this is I had to deal in a previous life back in the 90s. I got involved I was one of 9 subcontractors, and the primary contractor got into hot water. I mean, a $300 million lawsuit. And it was little things like this that just really were a pain in the neck to research. Anybody who's ever dealt with a lawyer, that the first thing the lawyer says is, I need documentation on this, 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 and this. That's the reason I'm stressing some of this information. You don't want to be up at 2:30 in the morning searching through your emails and your documents trying to find a lot of this stuff. If you've got a good structured documentation approach, it certainly helps. And I wish I had gone through a course like this before that lawsuit, because I would have known that if I had been documenting things the way I'm suggesting today, it would have made that information flow a lot easier. And the only thing worse than getting the documentation to a lawyer is when the lawyer doesn't use it. That's the only other thing that's really irritating. But if you could speed up your time by putting a lot of this information together into a structured format, it definitely helps. So talking about requests for information, let's translate a little bit over to, we talked about expectations for information. Well, what about expectations for testing? So this is something we would sometimes do, is we would say, okay, we want to make sure that if there's any tests that have been done along the way, we want to see them. And I'm not talking about testing once it's installed. I'm talking about, is there any testing that we need to be aware of that maybe certain materials have gone through? Not everything has gone through a lab for testing, but certain things may have. Many people may remember a couple years ago there was the big scandal about drywall out of China. So that may be a case we want to make sure, has this drywall been tested to make sure that it doesn't have anything that can cause cancer? That's the type of information we would ask for sometimes with the testing. Whether it be electronic or whether it be physical, we want to make sure, has any testing been done to make sure that this thing's not going to blow up in my face or cause any risk or health or safety items to any of my staff, my fellow employees, or any of the students that may be in the buildings. So if there's any types of documentation to show that testing has been done, it's great to have that in the beginning. Again, because you could be able to show, hey, we were told this had been tested. So it takes a little bit of the onus and the risk off of you, and it puts it on to the person and the company that product is associated with. The other thing about the testing is, if you're doing any testing or you have something tested, then document it here. So you could say, if somebody said, hey, we see these 9-inch floor tiles in a school, and anybody who ever thinks about 9-inch floor tiles, sometimes the first word they think of is asbestos. So you may say, for example, no, I've had it tested and the test came back negative. These don't need to be abated. They're not pretty, but they don't need to be abated. So testing like that might happen along the way before a construction job comes up, that's some good things to document. And one of the things, the reason I mentioned those 9-inch tiles is because that happened on the project. The contractor walked in and said, we can't drill holes in this floor to put in this network rack because it's got 9-inch tiles on the floor. And so next thing you know, the lawyer comes in and says, oh, we can't do this, we can't do that, we're going to have to get their blood work tested for ever so many years, and they're going to have to come in with all this personal protection equipment and set up plastic and blah, 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 blah. Well, I ended up having a guy who was working with me. He finally got tired of the rigmarole, and he said, you know what, I got a concept. And he reaches in his bag, he grabs a can of shaving cream, and he grabs his drill. He puts four blotches of shaving cream on the floor, drills 4 holes. Project was done. But just because we didn't have a proof that things had been tested in our buildings, much less with the products, it delayed everything for 2 weeks until finally this guy just lost his mind and bought a can of shaving cream and took in his drill. Great thing for me was that argument was over, but at the same time, it cost me a lot of time and effort in that project that really could have been saved if things had been proven. But also, the thing that you're trying to document here is who was responsible for that test. If it's a case where you can prove that you've done your due diligence, it's nobody in the district that's been working with it, that it's taking that onus and that risk off of you and placing it where it needs to be placed. So always keep a document of any testing that happens along the way. Rework we alluded to earlier, we kept a log of that. So essentially, that case of the board up with the boxes, that was definitely a case of a rework. And we wanted to make sure that when the quality control manager had identified that he needed to stop the work and that rework was approved to be done, that we said, you need to stay into the contract, then we would actually do that. We would keep it in a log along with the contract requirement that was being mentioned. So essentially we would say we identified this issue on this date. It is not in compliance with this part of the contract. This is the action that quality control manager had to take. This is the resolution that we expect, and whether or not it had been completed. So those were some of the primary items that we would identify of any rework that had to be along the way. Again, it's a case of, it's a lot of documentation, but it does make sure things don't fall through the cracks. And when we talk about meetings a little bit later, this is something we would use in the meetings is, hey, you have not done this item that we've got in the rework log, or have you and not told us? We would actually use this log quite a bit to identify non-conforming work and then making sure that work had been done and had been conformed with. And we would be the final say on that rework. So we would go back out again and confirm that had been completed. They might tell us it was completed on Thursday, but by golly, by Friday, we're going to make sure. Now, talking about the meetings. We had a meeting every Friday at 9 o'clock for a certain project. You may say, no, that's too much or that's too little. So determine what the frequency is going to be, but we always consistently had it at 9 a.m. on Friday. That's where I knew I was going to be, and pretty much on Thursday I was getting ready for that meeting. But we were going to hit it every Friday. We had a conference room that was set aside specifically for a project update, but we also determined who was going to be in there. So we always had primary people that were in there, who were the points of contact for the contractor, who were the points of contact for the client, anybody from the group I was working with. But occasionally we would have in different groups. So even though the project we were doing was sort of facilities, we definitely might have facilities there, but sometimes we ended up having work that we needed the IT department for. And what we would do is we would determine on a case-by-case basis beforehand by looking at some of these logs I was mentioning, like a rework log. If we saw that there was something with communication, we were going to be tying into the fiber optic network, for example. Well, that was a case we needed IT in there. And what we would do is when we were looking at the agenda, if we said, hey, IT is going to be in this meeting, then we were respectful of that, and we said, we need to get, IT is not going to care about the rest of this meeting. So let's go ahead and knock out the IT items first, make sure that they're comfy and hunky-dory with everything, that the contractor has their questions answered, and then we let IT go and take care of the other 19 things they need to do that hour. So always keep in mind who needs to be in a meeting, and are there any exceptions that need to happen on a case-by-case basis, and just be respectful of everyone's time and save some of the tough discussions until the end, but try to get some of the little items knocked out first. But also what we would do is we would document a lot of the meetings, and we actually put that in that said, we're actually, for these meetings, we're going to be keeping minutes. So we're going to set up an agenda. We're going to have that agenda out before the meeting, some way, shape, or form before the meeting about what we're going to do, who's going to be there, and then we'd also have the meetings or minutes from the previous meetings. And a lot of this was to not just document it, but if a contractor came up and said something, and I was pretty sure in a previous meeting they said something different, we kept a journal of all the minutes. So we just had a tape recorder. We kept a tape recorder in the meetings. I was fortunate enough to eventually get an administrative assistant that was one of her duties, was to document the meeting minutes as much as she could. We gave her about a 5-day period, 3 to 4 work days to get the minutes out. Try to have it out by Friday, for example, but try to get the meeting minutes out whenever possible so we could go back and review them. And then there were many times we had to show in the minutes, you said 3 weeks ago or 3 months ago. Sometimes we would see it. So those meeting minutes came very handy. Nowadays, instead of listening to a tape recorder with headphones on and typing it, I'd be interested to try Dragon. I've used it with on my phone, but it would be pretty interesting if you can put the recording in, use Dragon, and let it do the meeting minutes for you, so you just go in and review them and edit them versus having to type them from scratch. But we were definitely big on recording the meeting minutes and going back to them. We would pass out copies to the various people. A lot of times we emailed them to the primary points of contact that says, here's the meeting minutes from last week or the week before, this is FYI. And they would keep copies of that documentation because, the facility director on the base, I know he definitely used it quite a bit. And, even in the school projects where they kept a lot of the detailed minutes, that helped out with a lot of the projects there at some of the school districts I was working with back in the 90s as well. And a lot of that might end up affecting the contract. So these meetings, you're going to be discussing the contract. You're going to be discussing what the scope of work is. And a lot of these meeting minutes will be used if you need to go in and do an addendum to the contract, or if you need to start reviewing if a change order is going to happen. But these meeting minutes is where you need to document them so you can go back and review them, whether, again, it be digital or whether it be electronic or hard copy. Always keep them out there. And we actually would put in language such as, we're going to update the schedule per this. We're going to resolve items per that. We're going to address the items through this method. We're going to review health and safety plan issues. That was always a big thing we were making sure of, is making sure people were safe. So we always included that in the agenda to review if there were any possible effects from a health and safety standpoint. So going from meetings into the scope of work, like I say, some of these meetings, you're going to be talking about the scope of work, and some people, when they get into the nitty-gritty, is the definable features of work. Basically, what's the honey-do list that we're going to be doing in a lot of these plans and projects. So, looking, for example, at, making sure people understand what those definable features of work are. What are some of those phases, for example? And I'm sorry, I'm lost my, here we go. Okay, I'm back. Yeah, so making sure people understand what the technical scope is. Also, making sure that they understand the three phases of control, which is about what we're about to go into next. Making sure they understand that if you do this part of the scope, we're going to make sure we're prepared for it, and that this is the process to make sure everything flows smoothly. So making sure they get that list and the procedures to make sure that list gets done. So we're going to go into the big part of this now, is what's called the three phases of work. And so we're going to define them as preparatory, initial, and follow-up. So we're going to start with preparatory because really that's where you start. We're preparing to get ready for this project. Essentially, what we did in this phase was, before you drive the first nail or unplug the first item or slap down whatever it is you need to slap down in that project, we want to make sure everything is fine. Are there any drawings we need to review? Are there any testing reports we were talking about earlier? Any things that we had to do in that job? And that job that I'm using a lot of this presentation for, before we even walked in the buildings, we had to have all this documentation submitted in that basically said, okay, this is what we're installing. These are the features of it. It's not going to be dangerous. All that information was ready before we ever even walked into the buildings, because it had to be. That was just something that was required. They didn't want just anything going into the buildings. And the reason I'm saying this is the project that I ended up having to be pulled into this lawsuit on, the reason it was a lawsuit was because the specifications for boilers were not properly reviewed. What it came down to was that a lot of schools were having their boilers upgraded in a performance contract, but they didn't specify the boilers, and they didn't put them into the specifications of the schools that were out there. The boilers that got installed were not for schools. They were for laundromats. You want to talk about hell on wheels. I mean, it was just out of control what was happening. And plus, they didn't define what it would take to maintain it. So that was the other thing that they were missing that says, okay, in the meantime, you're going to have to do this chemical treatment. You're going to have to make sure that we've got these resources ready to handle these things. So even though these things were underperforming for what they were really designed for, on top of that, these things were rusting out in about 4 years. And that's how long this whole process was taking, was about a 4-year process by the time it was all said and done. A lot of bad blood came out. A couple people went to jail. I mean, it was nuts. But the project manager that was one of my mentors, his first day on the job, he walks in to the facility director with one piece of paper. And he sat down, he listened to the director of facilities, he listened to a person from the business office, and by the time they got done, he said, okay, I think I know what you want, and he takes that piece of paper and he puts it on the desk, and it was the correct specifications for the equipment needed for that school. It was one piece of paper, and that's all he had done. Was he had done his prep work about what was needed to basically get everything back online and to bring the project back around again. So it was something beautiful to absolutely watch. But it was because he had done an inspection. He had done his homework. He'd make sure that it was going to fit everything that they were looking for, because essentially it's going to save all that work down the road. It's going to save that bad blood. It's going to save you having to look for this and trying to remember that. So the preparatory phase is probably it is the most important. You want to make sure everything is running fine, as we'll see in the next two phases, but this is where the rubber is really going to meet the road. Is if this phase is not done correctly, that project can be hosed in some way, shape, or form as it goes on, because you don't want to be in that tear-it-out situation. I don't care how big it is or how small it is. You don't want to tear something out. You want to knock out the job and get to the next job. You don't want to have to delay and go back and tear something out again just because there's a difference in the interpretation or what someone's quote-unquote opinion is. You want to make sure that everything is the way that it is so it gets done right the first time. So there's a format. As I've been talking about with all these things, there's a format for the phase that you may want to consider. Make sure that people understand how it is that you're going to document it, that you're going to hold their feet to the fire, who's going to get copies of it, who's going to get notified of it, who's going to be a contact person, and if there's any other things that need to be done, these are all out there, but keep it on file, keep it on file, keep it on file. Now, here's a pretty typical form we would look at. This is a form I love to scare people with. It's actually not that bad. It's just a waste of paper if you ask me on some of the things, but there were times we would use at least one section. So we wanted to really document who was there. That was the number one thing we always made sure of, is what personnel were present to prepare or make sure that the preparations were done. If we had any documentation, anything that had been submitted, we might reference that. If there were any special requirements or places that materials needed to be stored, we would try to make sure we had that documented. And if there was anything with permits we had to get done, there was a section that was specifically related to that, along with any testing, safety considerations, any comments or remarks that were made along the way, or any additional thoughts that may have come out. We would try to document that. So even though this form looks daunting, it's actually pretty accurate to some things that happen when you're preparing to make sure that the jobs get done and that they're properly tested and documented and recorded, and you know who was there whenever this situation occurred. So now we prepared. Now we got to start. So the initial phase is basically saying, okay, you prepared for this job. We're ready to start turning the screws or whatever that the job is. So essentially, this is your jump-off point that says, okay, we're prepared. Now let's make sure that we're in the contract. This is really a big time for the contractor to show their stuff, that they are a quality workman group or that they have a great product that's dealt with. But essentially, this is just making sure you guys are in sync, that the school district and that the contractor is now that we're prepared, that we're working together. We're getting the job installed. We're making sure that things are falling into place. We're checking to make sure no rework needs to be done. We're doing some of our testing along the way. And we would have, of course, a form that we would say, here's the form that we're going to have out there, and the contractor is going to need a copy of that form. And we would explain how it's tied in, because we would reference back to the preparatory phase. When we saw this document, it said it was going to be done like this. We want to make sure that initial phase is tied back into it. And again, how it gets documented, who gets copied, and there's files that are going to be out there. But essentially what we were trying to do is just make sure that there were no conflicts on either side. Again, it was trying to make sure no bad blood was coming out, that if we're preparing and now we've got the installation phase going on, that we've got a good understanding of what's happening with each other. So again, we want to know who was there. Was there any prep work that needed to be done? Was there a good quality of workmanship? Was there any issues that got resolved that day that we needed to document? And again, safety first, safety first, safety first. Now, starting to close things out. We want to make sure, okay, you prepared, you've installed. Now we want to make sure that we're surveilling this whole process. We want to make sure everything's staying compliant and that there was good quality work. And we would have some kind of a routine that we would follow, not too closely. We didn't want you to know we're going to be there every Monday at 2 o'clock. But there's a possibility we could be there Monday at 3:45. We're just not going to necessarily always tell you. But we would say, hey, expect us to walk in at any point in time or contact you at any point in time to make sure that you're staying in compliance, that you're not having any issues, no communication problems that may be out there or any understanding of the scope. So, again, these phases are in place for a reason. They're in order for a reason. That it's just making sure everything flows nice and smooth. Some of the other things we would do is say we want to make sure that this is documented, that we are going to be documenting it. So we actually put that in the contract. That says, essentially, we're going to perform the following work. We're going to inspect it. We're going to document it. We're going to put it in a report, and this is why. We're making sure that all of the ducks are in a row and everything's running nice and smooth. And then we would say we want some kind of a report from the contractor. Some people call it a daily production report, a contractor report. It's basically some kind of report that says, this is what we did. We didn't have any safety issues. We had these materials that were going to be used that day. We wanted to make sure if we were going to be on the roof that we had these harnesses and other personal protection equipment. So all of that got documented. And the thing that always kind of struck me a little bit odd in the beginning, but it made sense later on down the road, is we actually put the weather information on that form too. So if someone said, well, we couldn't do this work because we had X amount of days of rain, I could actually take a look at this document, and because we were capturing that, I can say, yeah, they're right. It did rain that day. I forgot about that. And it's for a short project, that's not relevant. But for a major project that takes weeks and months, that may become relevant as it did with that particular project. So even the little things can really make a difference. And the other thing we would do is we would kind of do a spot check. So every once in a while, we would just see if our program was working. Were we staying with the contract? Did they have a copy at the site that they could go back and refer to? Not just the contract, but the plan of the contract, how we were going to enforce the scope of work and the definable features of work. Did we collect this documentation? So if someone says that they went through a safety certification program, we might wanted to see that. Or if someone says that they're accredited in something, we wanted to make sure we had a documentation of that. So we kept a lot of that in this little sanity check process file that was out there. And then what we would do is a lot of that got used just to make sure we were on flow, because eventually we want to get to the completion. We want to make sure if there was nothing else that needed to be done, then we could start doing our punch out. So basically my point of contact, that was the quality control, he would go out, hit the button, press the whistle, or whatever the case was he had to do, and If everything was fine, then he would let us know. If everything was not fine, he would let us know. But we made sure that any punch-out inspections that had been done got communicated to the proper people. If any problems came in, we would do things like our rework log I was talking a little bit about earlier, but we wanted to make sure everything was documented and everybody was in the loop. So we would say, this is what we're going to verify. This is where it's located in the contract, just to make sure everything was staying within the contract, and then making any corrections that if anything was found along the way, we wanted those fixed before we cut the check. And, I know that was something I had to do many times with the contractors is I would say, I'm not cutting you a check until I get verification that everything has been completed. And that guy and I would go round and round. It's been done. It's been done. I'm sure it has, but my quality control guy has not verified it. I'm not cutting the check until he gives the green light. Sorry. When he gives the green light, I'll sign the check. But until then, I'm sorry. I can't take your word for it. And that's just sometimes it gets that nasty, but sometimes that's very necessary to make sure that you're not stuck with a bum product. You never want to be stuck with a bum product. Now, as far as where the contract goes, you always want to stay, make sure that you're staying on track, but be ready for unexpected delays. It's going to happen. It's rained a lot. Budget constraint came in for whatever reason. So you're going to have to be ready for it, but you're going to have to think about how can you make a recovery on that schedule. How are you going to make adjustments along the way that's really going to help you power through that whole process? So what we would try to do is put together a lot of milestones. We use Microsoft Project and Primavera because that's what the military used at that point was Primavera. So even though we used Microsoft Project, we would try to be respectful of them and say, hey, here's an update to the schedule. But we always had a 2-week look ahead. So what we did with the contractors is we said, okay, if everything flows smoothly, where are you going to be at the next 2 weeks? What are you going to be doing the next 2 weeks? Because what if something is going to throw that off? That might be the case where you've got to bring in the IT folks because they need to review it. That helped with our weekly meetings is because we had that 2-week look ahead and we went, oh boy, we're going to have to do some work tying into the network. We got to have IT there. So we always forced a 2-week look ahead of our contractors. And then we also said that's going to affect whether or not we're going to cut them a check if we were paying them in phases, knowing that we probably had to be financially ready for that we're going to have to start any accounting processes. That helped us with that 2-week look ahead as well, and it helped grease the wheels in making sure that bus ran a little bit faster. So what other problems you're going to run into along the way? Well, basically, getting started without really should have been being started. You should have waited sometimes until the proper plans were in place. And it frustrated me when I first started this process that I've got to put together this plan. I got to get this documentation. I got to get that certification. It was torture, absolute torture. But once I did have it, everything ran smoothly. I mean, we had everything so much smoother after that, and we had to enforce things every once in a while. That we would sometimes say, well, we didn't think about this, we didn't think about that, and that's where scope creep and change of work would sometimes come into play. Is that some things were not properly developed. We're actually I'm going to be at a conference this weekend, and one of the great topics that I'm going to try to sit in on is questions I wish you had asked me. And it's basically a facility director who's saying, you're doing things to my buildings. You didn't ask me what effect it was going to have on the building, the occupants, the resources, and my budget. And it's basically because some people have not included all the proper people in the process, and so things are not properly developed, and then you end up with problems. You end up with rework along the way. So if you know there is a person who needs to be involved, then you've got to get their feedback. Otherwise, things could end up really having issues along the way. talking about documentation a bit earlier, I mentioned I would have a little bit of a story on documentation and submittals. This was a case where there were drawings that had to be provided. And so you have, for example, that you've got a group that says, hey, I want floor plans. Well, then we didn't realize it, whoever had put the contract together, they didn't involve the architect. And so they wanted all these plans and didn't involve the architect, who A, had some of the floor plans, and B, saw this as an opportunity to really expand the scope. And so what happened was there was nothing defined in the contract about what the floor plans were going to contain. And this guy was just adamant about, yes, I want the floor plans, but I also want to see the lines in the parking lot. I want to see the grading. I want to see the drains. I want to see every detail on it. Well, that wasn't in the scope, but because in our minds it wasn't in the scope. But it didn't matter what was in our minds. It was a matter of what was on that piece of paper about what the scope of the contract would be. And so not only do you sometimes have to define what is in the contract, but you may also have to define what will not be in the contract, because next thing you know, you've got this person who's pulling you off the job. You've got all these meetings you got to go to because somebody didn't take the time to talk to this guy and define what would be and what would not be in the scope. So one simple meeting could have changed that whole process. And I'm pretty sure he still got me on speed dial. But we also want to make sure that everything gets submitted in on time, but that the reports get properly filled out, especially if it's something safety related. If you need to make sure that things are running safe and smooth. In fact, we had a document called a Contractor Significant Incident Report, something like that. It's basically like OSHA. In fact, I think we also had an OSHA form just so we could report it officially to them. But essentially, they would tell us if something had gone wrong. So we always wanted to make sure that if they did have to submit a report like that, it was properly filled out so we could get that over to OSHA, to our risk manager or lawyer or whoever the case may be. Just making sure everything flows nice and smooth. You also want to make sure that if you identify a problem, hound them to make sure the problem gets taken care of, because there's a lot of great contractors out there, but I've seen some dirty ones at the same time, and they will try their best to paint over a hole in some way, shape, or form so you don't see it. So try to make sure if you see a problem that you make sure, A, it has been taken care of, and if you've got somebody who can verify that that's legit, then definitely do that, because you never want to fail to check out something. You unfortunately, there can't be 100% trust. And so, again, before you sign that final dot and send off that final check, you want to make sure everything is taken care of. So let's talk a little bit about the QA process. What we would do is we would try to make sure that we kind of had those I's dotted and T's crossed, and we would set the expectations for it. But we would say whether or not it was a good, fair, or poor. And essentially it was to make sure we had everything, but we also wanted to see the quality that was out there of the work, but also the quality of the installation and the process. So we would do it for the process. We would also do it for the documentation. And the reason we also did this is if we had another project down the road, would we want to really use that same company, that same person, that same contact or group in some way? This was a documentation that was out there in case somebody had other projects or they retired or they went to a different place or what have you, that they could go back and say, oh, yeah, those guys, that's what they did. Or this group, yeah, that's what they did. That was basically how we would react to a lot of these projects, because I left that company. If I hadn't had that documentation, that was something that I took in my head, that I'd be willing to bet a lot of people, they take things in their head all the time. But I was always good about documenting something. I would take a few minutes here, a few minutes there to just put notes together. But how do you hold it all together? That's one of the other biggest questions. When I saw all that documentation, I freaked out. I absolutely just freaked out about what I was going to have to track and how I was going to do it. But luckily, I had an administrator that she was great. She was just on the ball. She said, we've got so much stuff flying in here, we just need a methodology to store it. And so what I said was, wow, this is great. You know, you've got all of these topics basically broken out by things that needed to be tracked, such as are we getting a proposal from that contractor or other contractors? What's happening with the bids that we received? Did we issue a letter of intent and then we actually awarded the contract? And what's happening with change orders? So we had this whole structure of categories that she put together. And she put them pretty much in the order that a contract happens. And so what I said was, that's great, but she was only doing it for her filing cabinet. That was the issue, was, okay, now I got to go to the filing cabinet. It's great that I can find all this, but I'm kind of half electronic, half hard copy. So what I said was, let's take this same folder structure and let's replicate it in emails and electronic folders on our share drive. And just to show you how powerful that one little trick was of just planning and coordinating, when I got got my own administrative assistant, it took me 45 minutes to train her. That was it. I mean, she already knew Word, she already knew Excel, she knew how to check email. That's all I needed. I just needed somebody who was just very good at coordination and very good at electronic and as well as hard copy. And so I'd had that folder structure in place just a couple of days. And once I showed her how the categories were, she was up and going in no time. So what we would do is we would have this system of, if it's a hard copy, it goes into this box. I do what I need to do, put it in this other box. She files it, done. I mean, it was just greasing machine. Just great process. And this is just kind of another layout. For those folks that download a hard copy, I just wanted to include the other things that we were tracking with the managing of not just the contractors but the subcontractors. Any correspondences that have been happening. We had to also print hard copies, even of emails sometimes. So we would say, okay, we've got our emails here. We're going to print a hard copy and put it into the file folder if we needed to, the hard copy file folder. But also schedules, any safety reports that needed to be done, even if we had some things related to packing slips. Sometimes we even set up a little folder for that in case it was something important. But it was all this whole process. And the great thing was, when I set this up electronically, is basically I created a folder template, and then and it was just empty. It was just all these folder names empty, so I just created it one time. And then what I did was, whenever a project would come along, I would copy that folder structure into that new project folder and then just start populating it. So it's almost like I created an empty folder structure first that I could copy as a template or a boilerplate into other folders. And I did the same thing with email. I would basically have this project template folder structure that I kept as an email, and then what I would do is I would copy that as I could over into a new folder structure in case I was getting a lot of emails about that project. So just something that I wanted to put for those folks that download the presentation that you may want to consider and use for your for your own project infrastructure. So that's a lot of the main things I wanted to make sure we had a chance to cover today. Definitely feel free to, if you want any of the documentation or forms as samples, I've got copies of those that I can make available. But I just wanted to thank everyone for taking time with me. Matthew, any types of questions, stories, thoughts?
I have no questions in chat, and I have no questions on hold. We'll give them one more chance. Please type in your questions in the chat if you have any. If you'd like to ask David a question, please hit 7# on your phone, and that'll notify me that you have a question. We'll give you about a minute.
Because I know I'm not that good.
Well, you were pretty damn good in my opinion.
Yeah, like I say, anybody who wants documentation or how I had it out there, what I'll do is I'll put this to everyone, but my email is just dave@schooldude.com. So definitely feel free that if you would like to see some of these forms, the actual full copies or the specifications that I used at this process, I'll be glad to pass that along to anyone.
Okay, we have no questions. Everyone, thank you very much for coming today. Dave, thank you as well. That was excellent. For those of you that are signed up in the online course, the webinar next Tuesday is on as planned. So look out for that. Thank you all, and have a great week.
All right.
The moderator has ended the conference. Goodbye. Thank you for calling.